it's done. Hey guys, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. It is time to wrap up this Tudor house build series. This is part 4 in the build, and if you missed the first 3 episodes, go back, check them out, show you how to build it, how to do the stucco, how to do the shingles. And today, I'm going to show you how I finished it, how I painted it. One of the reasons that I broke this series up into different episodes is because usually when I build something and do it start to finish in one video, I start running out of time at some point, and it's always the paint job that suffers. I've built a lot of really great things that then get a pretty mediocre or even bad paint job because I rush it at the end. This time, I didn't have to worry about that. I could actually focus and do a good job painting this house that I'd spent so much time building. And I think it's probably the best piece of terrain I've ever painted. I'm not a phenomenal painter, but I'm getting pretty decent at it, and I have no complaints about how it turned out. It looks really good. So today I'm going to show you how I did it, what I did. It's not just going to be paint though. There's also some cool finishing details like some weathering stuff, some moss, and the most fun thing I think is the glass in the windows. So that's pretty neat. Yeah, let's paint a house. Before painting this piece, I applied my Black Magic base coat. This is just a mixture of matte Mod Podge and black paint. It serves a few purposes. The main reason I do it is that it adds a lot of strength to the little foam parts, especially on areas like the roof made up of many tiny fragile pieces of foam. It makes things like the shingles far stronger and sturdier, and it helps bond them all together. When I make this, I mix the black paint right into the Mod Podge to help me see where I've covered and to kill 2 birds with 1 stone by getting my black undercoating done at the same time. It wasn't necessary to cover the grout that I used for the stucco with the Mod Podge, as it was already very hard and secure, but it was just easier to cover the whole thing. And I like having everything blacked out to give the build a nice cohesive, non-distracting look before starting the color. The majority of this house is wood, so that's where I started my painting efforts. I've discussed this in several different videos, but I have a particular way I like doing old weathered wood. The trick is to not start with a dark brown, but instead use a light golden brown that is pretty diluted with water. This appears quite drastic when first applied, but when it dries, the black undercoat shows through and darkens the color. This color will be greatly toned down in the later steps as well. I actually did 2 thin coats of the golden brown before moving on to the next color. I'm not the type to get one part of a model painted start to finish at a time. I prefer to block out all the main colors first, then move on to the layering steps. For this reason, I next switched over to painting out the brickwork. I painted out all the bricks with a medium gray. This gray was a very neutral black-white gray without much undertone of color. Often, I prefer using a tan or brown undertoned gray for bricks, but I knew I wanted to do the stucco with a tan, and I wanted a strong distinction between the colors, so I opted for a neutral gray. Next, I blocked out all the stucco using a light tan or kind of khaki color. This was probably the most time-consuming part of the paint job, as I had to cut in all the corners, and it took a few coats to get a nice opaque color. For some added visual interest, I decided to go in with a few different contrasting colors and paint a handful of the bricks. This looks really comical at this stage, but after the dry brushing and the washes, the contrast is subdued and it creates a really interesting look. Check out my video that focuses on brick painting techniques if you want to get some more guidance. I used a gunmetal metallic to paint out all the small little metal details on this build, which wasn't really much, just like the door hinges, the door knocker, and the chimney pipes. The next part of the wood painting was to do a dry brushing of a light tan. Adding this element makes the details of the wood grain really pop, but it also gives the wood a really worn and weathered appearance. I found that this combination of golden brown undercoat, tan dry brushing, and later a black wash really makes the most believable looking aged wood. The second step in painting the stucco took some patience. I went over everything with a lighter shade of tan, but was careful to only paint the higher flat surfaces, leaving the darker color in the recesses. Because each section of stucco was framed by wood, I had to be really careful and do this in a tidy and detailed fashion. At this point, the building still looks really high contrast and kind of ridiculous. It's at this point the all-star of the paint job steps in. The black wash. For this, I used my homemade black wash recipe. I'll put a link up in the corner of the screen to a video where I walk you through the process and recipe for making this wash. I think this step can be intimidating for a lot of new painters, but once you've done it a few times, you learn to just trust the wash. Be liberal with your application. Go over everything, let it do its work, and remember it will dry looking a lot better than it looks when it's wet. Normally, I just apply the wash and walk away while it dries, but in this instance, I wanted to remove some of it from the higher, flat surfaces of the stucco so that it didn't look quite as dark and grimy all over. For this, I just used some damp toilet paper to dab and wipe away the excess from areas I wanted to remain lighter. To make this process easier, I did one side of the building at a time so that I could wipe away the wash while it was still wet. If you wait until it dries, you will need to use a lot more water and abrasion to get the wash off areas, and you're likely to wipe off some of the paint below it in the process. To add even more variety to the paint job, I next went in with a brown wash. Again, this is just my homemade recipe. I hit a lot of the corners of the stucco and areas where I thought dirt and grime was likely to settle. I also wanted to add some mildew and organic streaking to the piece, so I mixed up a quick green wash. To do this, I just took some very bright green acrylic ink and darkened it using my already made brown wash. This created a nice dark olive green wash that I could apply to areas where I wanted it to look like moss and mildew were forming on the building. I focused mostly on the lower portion of the building, adding more to the corners and crevices, but I also wanted a fair amount on the wood shingles. I tried to do this more in a streaking pattern, with it focused mostly on the drip edge of the roof. To take this moss and mildew look even further, I created a three-dimensional moss texture that I could apply. This is really easy to do. I simply take some fine turf in a dark olive color and mix it with some watered down PVA glue. This creates a sort of slurry that I can then brush onto the piece. As the glue dries, it will go invisible, leaving only the clumps of flocking. This creates an amazing look that is very durable. On this build, I made sure to only apply the moss to one side of the building so that all of the YouTube scientists didn't have to scream in outrage in the comment section about moss only growing on one side of things. This one's for you. Now this is where I started to get experimental, right at the end of a basically finished piece, which seems to be a habit of mine. I wanted to add glass to my windows. This was especially important because the order in which I built the house meant I was left with a parchment paper behind the upper floor window, and I wanted that to visually disappear. I decided to try using Vallejo water texture to create glass. Since I wanted to hide the white parchment, I didn't want this to dry completely clear, so I decided to tint it with a tiny bit of yellowy kind of orange paint in the hopes of simulating glass lit by candlelight. This was a little tricky to apply from the mixing palette, but I found I was able to do so with a brush. This water texture takes a while to cure, so I left it for like over a day before moving on to the next side. For the lower windows, I still needed something to hold the water in place as it cured, so I taped on some parchment to the inside of the building to create sort of a dam. I wanted to test how this stuff would look if I just left it clear without any tinting, so I was able to apply it this time straight out of the bottle, which was a lot easier than doing so with a brush. After it cured, I was able to remove the parchment from the interior and was left with just the clear water effects, which created a pretty great looking glass. What's interesting is that even though I didn't tint the lower windows, they still ended up pretty yellow. I've used this water texture in other applications before, and it dries totally clear, so I'm guessing what happened is that it hydrated and picked up some of the paint or the wash from the piece and yellowed the resin. This was fine by me. It looked pretty cool, and old world glass was never really that clear anyway. One thing I didn't like though was how it made the window frames very glossy, which didn't quite look right for a wood framed window. To counteract this, I went in with some brush on matte varnish and painted out the wood frames. Lastly, I figured I'd put the glass windows to good use and add some lighting effects. You don't need to get too complicated with this, you can just use dollar store tea lights. Usually I don't even attach these to the piece so that I can just swap them in and out easily, but I decided to attach the one for the upper floor. To do this, I just cut a tiny hole for the LED to go through and hot glued the tea light to the ceiling of the piece. The lower floor I could just use freestanding tea lights. Overall, I'm really happy with the way this piece turned out. I think the build is quite good, and I'm really happy with the paint job and all the little finishing details. If you want to pick up any tools or supplies to tackle your own build, head over to blackmagiccraft.ca. There I have my essential equipment store with links to all of the stuff that I regularly use and recommend. This way you get the tried and tested tools and supplies, and you can help fund videos like this one by shopping through those Amazon affiliate links. If you enjoy videos like this and you get a lot of value out of them, consider supporting Blackmagic Craft on Patreon. Doing so enables me to dedicate my time and effort into making these videos and helping out the community. I'd love to have your support, and mostly I'd love to have you as the newest member of the Blackmagic Craft Fellowship. There you have it, guys, another build complete. I'm really glad to see this one done, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. This is one that I'm definitely proud to have sitting on my shelves, and I look forward to using it in some games. It'll get some limited use in D&D, but it will have a lot of reusability in skirmish games like Frostgrave. I hope that you found this video and this entire series enjoyable, informative, entertaining, most of all, inspiring. If this series has inspired you to build your own little Tudor style foam house, I'd love to see it. So if you post pictures in places like the Tabletop Crafters Guild Facebook group or on Instagram, be sure to tag Blackmagic Craft so that I can see it. That's it for this week, guys. Hope you have a great weekend. Hopefully you play some games. Cheers, see you next week.